America's agricultural collapse. How Canada quietly took over the world's food supply. In early 2025, few noticed the warning signs. There were whispers, delayed shipments, missed deadlines, quiet frustrations from trading partners. Some believed it would all blow over, that the United States, the world's dominant agricultural force for generations, would get back on track. But instead of stabilizing, the ground began to shift slowly, silently, and with devastating precision. Now, just 6 months later, American farmers are watching their fields overflow with unsold crops, while Canadian food exports surge to levels never seen before. This isn't a story about war. It's not about natural disasters or political sabotage. It's about what happens when trust erodes, not all at once, but acre by acre, contract by contract, shipment by shipment. The first cracks, it began with hope. Hope that Canada might drop a contentious export tax amid ongoing negotiations. But instead, American trade officials were met with silence. Then came the retaliation of formal investigation, signaling the potential for a new round of tariffs. By the time the headlines caught up, the damage was done. "We've made deals with China," a U.S. official said. "We've made deals with probably 4 or 5 different countries." But deals mean nothing if no one can deliver. As corn costs rose, beef prices climbed, and fertilizer inputs like nitrogen and potash became harder to secure. The American agricultural engine started to sputter. Canada, a major supplier of potash, was no longer just a supporting actor. It was becoming the main supplier. And in just 6 weeks, the United States began losing what had taken generations to build global agricultural dominance. Not because of a global conflict, not because of drought or floods, but because of something more dangerous: substitution. $9 billion gone, and the numbers tell the story. More than $9 billion in agricultural orders have vanished, redirected into new contracts, new logistics routes, and most importantly, new trade relationships. But the most shocking part? This wasn't orchestrated by adversaries. These weren't moves from rogue economies or authoritarian regimes. This came from allies, from partners, from the very nations the U.S. used to call brothers at the G7 table. As American soybeans sat idle and beef spoiled in refrigerated storage, Canada's agricultural exports jumped an astonishing 37% during May and June 2025 alone. That's not mere growth. That's a shift in global command. The collapse at the G7. What triggered the mass exodus? It wasn't a protest. It wasn't even a formal declaration. It was an absence. At the June G7 summit, while the world's focus was on defense, spending, and energy policy, another, quieter drama unfolded. The President of the United States abruptly left the summit early. Trade negotiations that were expected to yield new agreements instead collapsed into silence. There was no joint communique, no shared vision. Into that vacuum stepped Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Behind closed doors, Carney held a flurry of bilateral meetings with Japan, France, Germany, the UK, and Italy, countries that had collectively imported over $74 billion in American agricultural goods in 2023. And in the span of just days, he began redrawing the global food map, not with diplomacy, but with contracts. Not in ink, but in grain, beef, dairy, and soy. The pivot becomes real. The results came fast. Japan, once the second largest buyer of American soybeans and wheat, began rerouting orders to Canada. France and Germany finalized dairy and grain contracts with Ottawa that now stretch through the end of 2026. The UK, a historic buyer of U.S. soy, shifted 40% of its import contracts to Alberta and Saskatchewan. These weren't symbolic gestures. These were operational changes. Cargo ships now sailing to Europe and Asia are increasingly being filled in Halifax, Not New Orleans. American goods are no longer the first option. They're the riskier one. Consequences at home back in the U.S. The fallout hit hard. Corn prices in Iowa dropped to their lowest point in nearly a decade. Soybean storage in Kansas exploded past capacity, forcing local governments to subsidize emergency grain silos just to prevent mass spoilage. USDA reported that combined national corn and soybean inventory crossed 52 million tons, the highest level since 2013. And the next harvest was just weeks away. In Nebraska, small and mid-sized farms began to collapse under the weight of unpaid loans. Regional banks suspended agricultural credit lines. Cold storage facilities, once planning to expand, froze their projects due to uncertainty. Federal farm relief programs, once assumed to be renewed automatically, are now caught in political deadlock. Without them, farmers may soon face tens of billions in additional financial strain, just as they lose their most loyal overseas buyers. This isn't just about exports. It's about survival. When trust breaks, this is not a quality issue. American food remains world-class. But quality alone isn't enough. The issue is reliability. Over the past 2 years, America's shifting export policies, customs bottlenecks, and tariff threats have made international buyers nervous. And now, those buyers are simply choosing to work with someone more predictable. When a cargo ship docks in Rotterdam today, the containers aren't filled with Midwestern grain. They're packed with Canadian produce. When Japanese supermarkets stock their beef shelves, it's not from Texas, it's from Alberta. When Italian pasta manufacturers need Durham wheat, they don't scan invoices from Kansas. They scan ones from Manitoba. In rural Canada, the transformation is unmistakable. Harvesters run longer hours. Storage barns are expanding. Farm credit is flowing freely. And growers who once struggled are now scaling operations at record pace, not because they undercut the U.S., but because they remained steady when America wavered. A cross-border collapse, the erosion of trust, didn't stop at the G7. It reached south to Mexico, the United States' largest agricultural export market. In 2024, the U.S. exported over $31 billion in food and farm products to Mexico. The relationship seemed unshakable. But then came the border crackdowns, immigration raids near processing plants, increased customs delays, administrative chaos. Suddenly, American exports slowed to a crawl. Mexican importers didn't hold press conferences. They didn't file complaints. They found a backup plan. That backup plan wore a red maple leaf. Canada, Mexico, the $5 billion pivot in April 2025. Canadian trade delegations quietly arrived in Mexico City. 2 months later, a sweeping $5 billion agricultural trade deal was signed. The focus? Soybeans, frozen beef, wheat, and dairy. Almost overnight, Canadian goods began flowing to Mexican ports like Veracruz. Not American. By the end of Q2 2025, U.S. food exports to Mexico had dropped 18%. Canadian exports had risen 16%, their largest quarterly gain in more than 10 years. In border towns like El Paso, McAllen, and Nogales, the consequences are stark. Idle trucks, empty silos, frozen lines of credit, disappearing contracts. Farmers in Iowa, who once viewed Mexico as a permanent partner, now watch helplessly as their neighbors trade without them. And for Mexican buyers, the decision isn't political, it's logistical. They're not turning their backs on the U.S., they're avoiding the chaos. And Canada, with its stable policy environment and fast customs process, has become the better bet. The cost of instability. While Canada builds relationships, the U.S. holds hearings. Congress debates subsidies. Committees issue reports. But international buyers are not watching C-SPAN. They're watching spreadsheets, delivery times, and port clearance data. The result? 5 of the US's most vital agricultural markets, Japan, the UK, France, Germany, and Mexico, are pivoting away. And not with press releases, with purchase orders. The next 6 months, if these trends continue, the U.S. is headed for more than just an export crisis. The ripple effects could be enormous. When farmers lose buyers, rural banks lose borrowers. When goods don't move, transportation networks shrink. And when trust is lost, no tariff, subsidy, or statement can bring it back quickly. This is about more than just trade policy. It's about the credibility of the U.S. as a supplier. For decades, that credibility was unquestioned. Now it's being questioned in every global procurement meeting. A warning in wheat at this very moment. Across the globe, contracts are being signed not with U.S. exporters, but with Canadian suppliers. Each signature is a signal. The world no longer waits for Washington. It doesn't need a press conference. It needs a delivery schedule, and that schedule increasingly begins in Saskatchewan, not Kansas. So what happens now? Will the U.S. government stabilize its agricultural policies? Will it repair relationships with trusted partners? Can American exporters regain lost ground? The next harvest will tell us. But by then, it may already be too late, because markets don't just wait and trust. Once lost is rarely rebuilt with words. It takes reliability. And in 2025, the most reliable food supplier in the West isn't the United States. It's Canada.